and this is Keen On, the daily Now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Friday, May the 10th, 2024. It's been an interesting tech week. A lot of it was associated with the Apple's introduction of a new team of iPads, significant upgrade. They haven't upgraded the product for a couple of years. In technological terms, Verge talked about the 7 biggest announcements, but the biggest announcement of all wasn't intended by Apple. It was a consequence of an ad they ran called Crush, which has aroused enormous anger. TechCrunch, which is supposedly the voice of online tech media, described this ad as disgusting, and has even inspired Keith Teare, our technology maven, the author of That Was the Week newsletter, a technology newsletter that summarizes weekly events, to build his editorial around it. Keith is joining us, as always, from Palo Alto, the heart of tech country. Keith, before we get to it, let's run the ad. I'm sure most people have seen it, but let's watch it first, and then we can talk about why it's aroused so much anger. So, Keith, not everyone will have been able to watch that. A lot of our viewers aren't viewers, they're listeners. Describe the ad and then explain why, in your view, it's aroused so much anger and hostility and controversy.
So what Apple does is it piles up lots of things into a crushing machine, like those machines that crush old cars into boxes. A variety of things, but it includes a piano, a guitar, some plastic toys, lots of pots of paint of varying colors,
and a little guy, a Crush guy, who gets
crushed. That's the plastic toy. Yeah, that's the plastic toy. And it also includes, I don't know how many people notice this, but some old iPads. So it's basically saying, here's all the stuff that we wanted to put inside the iPad. That's my interpretation. And then at the very end, after the crushing is done, it lifts up and there's a new iPad that presumably is the product of what you might think of.
Yeah, it's for an old Marxist Hegelian like you, Keith. This is a commercial version of Marx's engine of history, unstoppable.
It's creative destruction, Andrew, is what it is. It's creative destruction because the message is creation, not destruction.
So it's a great. I thought it was a very good ad. They've since withdrawn it. We'll talk about why, which seems also very odd. Why, again, going back to this TechCrunch headline, in your editorial, you said it's been an interesting 72 hours at TechCrunch. We also joked before we went live that if Mike Arrington still ran TechCrunch, Devin Calderway, who wrote that the Apple Crush ad is disgusting, would have already been fired. But what offends people about this?
Well, to try to empathize with the detractors, I think they're sitting in like the royal box at the theater, observing the proles down below, and reflecting on from the position of high culture, looking at this as the destruction of tradition. They don't like the destruction of tradition or the way things used to be done, and they are reacting to Apple's assertion that the iPad can replace, for most people, all of those things that get contained within the new iPad. Rather than, I don't think crushed is the right word. They're using a crusher to create a containment inside.
Well, let's give TechCrunch, to be fair, let's explain what they argue. And I'm quoting the TechCrunch piece. What we all understand, though, because unlike Apple ad executives, we live in the world, is that the things being crushed here represent the material, the tangible, the real. And the real has value. value that Apple clearly believes it can crush into yet another Black Mirror. Is this just hardcore anti-tech stuff, Keith? From TechCrunch of all places.
It's rhetorical flourish, really, because of course an iPad is real as well. An iPad isn't pretend; it's real. So what they're really saying is they prefer the old version of reality rather than the new version of reality, but they're trying to masquerade that as the difference between real and not real. Well, that's a false proposition right at the core. And by the way, Devin does a few false propositions through this piece, which is clearly driven by animal emotion, not by intellect.
He also says, and this comes back to the issue of media itself, he said, what Apple is doing is destroying these things to convince you that you don't need them. All you need is the company's little device, which can do all that and more, and no need for annoying stuff like strings, keys, buttons, brushes, or mixing stations. We're all dealing with the repercussions of media moving wholesale towards the digital and always on online. Is this a journalist just nostalgic for newspapers?
Well, I think nostalgic and angry, because what he's saying there is a few things. Firstly, Apple isn't saying you don't need the things it's crushing. It's saying it can put them inside an iPad and give you another way of using them. For someone like me who doesn't play guitar or piano, actually the iPad is probably the only way I get to be creative using piano sounds and guitar sounds. So the false proposition there is that Apple is seeking to replace. It isn't. It's seeking to incorporate. That's what it's doing. And
the irony of all this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this new announcement or this new cycle of products, the iPad products, aren't very revolutionary. They're just another upgrade. They're not talking about radically reinventing media.
Yeah, at the end of the day, and this was said by, I forget the guy's name on YouTube that does all the reviews that recently that have been hammering various AI things, the African-American guy, I'm blanking on his name, but he said, at the end of the day, it's still an iPad. And an iPad is a device searching for a use case. I use it for reading mostly, to be honest. Sometimes I use it for email, but rarely. So I think the iPad is still just an iPad. I don't use it for Final Cut Pro. I use my desktop for that because it's easier to use. So I think at the end of the day, this is I use the word snowflake. Maybe you can put up that graphic.
Yeah, I knew you would somehow manage to squeeze in your right-wing views, Keith, on this. Snowflake. Why is this snowflake?
Well, this term snowflake was almost created for this moment. It says that a snowflake is a person that has an inflated sense of uniqueness, an unwarranted sense of entitlement, or are overly emotional, easily offended, and unable to deal with opposing opinions. That basically is
that's the definition of people we don't agree with. But is Devin at TechCrunch, is he a snowflake? I mean, the thing is, what I don't understand is how I can see people being irritated by something like this, but how could you be offended?
I showed it to my kids just to test, and my kids are, from 17 to 23, and you would imagine very much of the modern age. Every single one of them liked it. I used a lot of tweets in my editorial that were very positive about it as well, mainly from creative people. So yeah, it's a puzzle, actually, Andrew. Even for me, it's a puzzle. You alerted me to it. I wasn't aware of the backlash.
Well, you live in you're in the bubble, Keith. You're in Palo Alto. I'm sure that they control media there so that you don't even get to see the anti-Apple stuff.
And Alexander, one of our listeners, tells me it's Marques Brownlee who did the.
Good. Well, you shouldn't forget people, Keith, especially if people of other colors or genders. So what about Apple's response? I have to admit, I was rather disappointed. I think in the Steve Jobs age, he never would have backed down on this, would he?
It is shocking that Apple has also become a bit snowflake, or at least they're scared of snowflakes. Which you're right. It is shocking that they apologized, but on the other hand, Is it shocking? It's kind of like to be expected in this day and age where nobody wants to be controversial. And
But it's not even being, I mean, it's not even a controversial ad. It's anything but controversial. It's just some nice video, some good music, and some paint spewing out. And that's the end of it.
It definitely doesn't augur well for Apple's decision-making internally that they apologize, because that implies that they're prepared to allow their product and marketing to be influenced by outlier sensitivity.
Yeah, and you didn't have this in this week's newsletter, but it does contrast vividly with some of the decisions of other big tech companies. Google comes to mind, the CEO there, who pushed back decisively when some of the Google employees decided to occupy one of the offices. They were having none of that. So there's no snowflakes in some of the bigger other companies.
Well, there probably are, but they're not winning right now, at least in Google. But
maybe it's the marketing people who are particularly sensitive and easily swayed. I'm not sure if they're snowflakes. They just don't like controversy.
Well, look, if you contrast this to Apple's 1984 ad, which was aggressively against the past, the object of that ad was the establishment.
Yeah, we should show it, but we don't have it on.
And the establishment was defined as IBM. So they wanted to destroy IBM PCs. That was the core of that ad. And at that time, everyone loved it because everyone was anti-establishment. What's happened now is the mood of the nation or the world has become highly individualistic and oversensitized. And so an ad which is essentially...
You and I, Keith, we're the last two liberals left in the world, are we?
We might well be, but you know, this ad has essentially the same message. The past is not as good as the future.
And that's the title. Of course, it comes with your dreadful AI art, which certainly speaks of the past being worse than the future. But the title of your editorial is Hating the Future. I mean, the other problem here, Keith, is anytime anyone's critical of technology, people like you come along and say, oh, they just hate the future. I mean, you can be critical of the future without hating it.
Well, I think you can also love guitars and pianos without hating this ad.
I agree.
So I love guitars and pianos. I wish I could play them. I would love that, and I'd have one in my house and I'd play it, but I can't. So I'm not against artifacts of the past. I love them, but neither am I against incorporating their functionality into something I can use. That seems great to me.
Yeah, so, and what's interesting is what's left out of here are the two most important things in terms of and we've talked about this endlessly on the show, the economic crisis of the creative class. Firstly, the reality, the dark reality of AI on the horizon. And secondly, the business models. I mean, at least Apple sell their stuff. They don't sell it off advertising. So they're not undermining guitarists or pianists or filmmakers in the sale of iPads.
In fact, they pay them a lot of money for streaming on Apple Music, and they promote developers producing fantastic sketching tools or painting tools and so on. So Apple genuinely is very pro creator. Yeah,
there you have it. Anyone from Apple watching, you can advertise on That Was the Week. Keith, what should we charge them? $1 million an hour?
You know, just because they're Apple, I think it should be 2 million.
Yeah, well, we might accept 1 million, so we'll take calls after. So leaving aside this, which is an interesting story, but I don't think it has much legs. What else happened this week, Keith? Anything interesting?
You know, now you're making me use my memory. There was a lot.
You could have used your iPad. Maybe the next video will be of human beings being put into the crusher and their brains being spewed out.
There's a lot in the essays of the week section. It's heavily dominated by venture capital news and by pandemic era companies losing money news.
Yeah, I sent you that FT piece on the pandemic era winners suffering $1.5 trillion fall in market value. And some of the companies, a couple of them surprised me. Pinterest is included, and Tesla is the largest. One would assume Zoom. None of this is surprising. I mean, wasn't that inevitable?
Yeah. I mean, in the same way that when the world changes, there's always winners and losers. I mean, there's the change that's happening now, which is the growing nationalism, is feeding a military sector that really wasn't even in existence during COVID. So when the world changes, there are winners and there are losers, and those companies' destiny is tied to what's going on in the underlying world. So absolutely, it was very predictable. A friend of mine, John Callahan, is at True Ventures. They were one of the first, if not the first, investor in Peloton, which is mentioned in this article.
Yeah, we talked about, I mean, Peloton's the ultimate COVID. I mean, they're not even included in this chart, but they're the most.
They're down below in the article.
Right.
They have their own chart because it's such a compelling example.
What's weird is that why is Tesla why do you think Tesla's the leading company in this? Because I don't see Tesla as a COVID company.
Actually, if you look at the math on that, Tesla has lost the least. So the bigness of the chart is to do with its retention of value. And so they've lost the least because Tesla has grown massively. I'm going to sneeze, I think. Tesla has grown massively. Excuse me. Predictive. Since COVID. I think it more or less doubles production every year. So Tesla's the least of the losers, but it still has marginally lost since COVID, because people during COVID started buying things. I don't know if you remember that, but people started buying.
Yeah, and it comes back to the ad about we've returned to the real world for all the Apple haters of the iPad world and the defenders of the real. We've returned to reality. We don't mostly spend all our time now on Zoom, and that was inevitable.
Agreed. And Zoom's a big loser as well, huge loser. Although if you look at the value of Zoom from pre-COVID to now, it's still growing significantly and it's still a great company. So all of these things have to.
Although we don't use it, we still use Restream.
Yeah, Steve Gilmore still uses it.
Well, if Steve Gilmore uses it, it must be good. Another couple of pieces in your newsletter this week that intrigued me. Something about Jack Dorsey, looking very much like Jack Dorsey, claims that Blue Sky is repeating all the mistakes he made at Twitter, and I think he's quit the board, maybe got pushed out. We don't hear much anymore about X or Twitter or social media. Maybe is that one going away, Keith? Is Blue Sky? There was a lot of promise of Blue Sky for about 20 minutes a year or two ago, and we haven't heard anything since.
Well, what Jack is focused on is, broadly speaking, let's call it censorship, but it's really not only censorship. It's
he's not doing snowflakes, is he, Keith? Jack Dorsey.
He basically is. That's why I put it in. He's reacting against snowflakes as well, and he's making the point that Blue Sky is now run by snowflakes, and therefore trying to control the content, and that's the reason he left Twitter. And
I have to say, I mean, for people who are listening, we have a photo of Jack Dorsey looking like Rasputin with a very long grey beard. He isn't a snowflake, although sometimes he sounds a little like one. Maybe his voice is a bit snowflakey.
To me, he looks like, is it Voldemort?
Out of Lord of the Rings, probably. He
could also be Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Well, we've gone away and we never hear about Mastodon anymore, Keith. I mean, some of these things are inevitable, aren't they?
Well, I mean, if we stand back and just treat the subject seriously, somebody trying to build a software version of the public square, if that's their goal, it's a reasonable goal. What comes with that is a diversity of opinions. I mean, David Hornick this morning, who is one of the most
old friend, a very smart guy,
he wrote a piece on, I think it was Facebook, defending the right of anti-Semites to speak. And David is against anti-Semitism, but he said you
he's Jewish.
He's Jewish, and he made the point that free speech is more important than anti-Semitism or the opposite. You have to support free speech. Then you give them enough rope that what comes out is how obnoxious they are. So we're living in a moment where David Hornick's very correct views in my point of view, and not the dominant.
But that's I take your point, but that's got nothing to do with the failure of Blue Sky and Mastodon, is it? Or are they actually? Is Jack Dorsey saying that Blue Sky is trying to censor what people can say?
Yes, he is.
On the other side, you've got Trump now with his own social media platforms that are doing the reverse in some ways.
Yeah, no, Jack's only point is what I just said. That's why he left. Now you're right as well that if you wanted to analyze why Blue Sky isn't very popular, it's not related to that. It's for other reasons, and we can discuss that separately. But he's not leaving because it's a failure. He's leaving because it's trying to stop various points of view from existing on its platform.
Can you imagine how Blue Sky erupted over this Apple ad? I'm sure X as well. Everyone was outraged. These platforms, though, exist on outrage. If people aren't outraged, then people don't post and people don't read it.
The most outrage was Threads, because that's where snowflakes live. Threads should be called snowflakes, because I don't
say that again, Keith. That might be the title of our the headline of our piece. Threads is where snowflakes live. Is this? How old are you, Keith?
How old?
Yeah.
I am pretty old, Andrew. I'll be 70 in August.
Is this the kind of reactionary sourness of a almost 70-year-old saying Threads is where snowflakes lives? Threads is where young people live. So
no, it is not.
Isn't it?
Which young? None of my young people in my family.
We've got 3 boys. I mean, they're not necessarily.
Jeff Jarvis is the icon for Threads, and Jeff's certainly not. He might be older than me.
Oh, okay. Well, so this is not a generational declaration.
Snowflakes do trend both old and young, interestingly, because a lot of the hippie generation have turned into snowflakes. But I think it's hard to define snowflakes by age. It's more by
when Threads came out, you were critical. We did a show, it was probably a year or 2 ago, saying that Threads was. You were disappointed because Threads was avoiding politics, but you're saying it's in its own way quite political.
Well, one-dimensionally, there's no counterpoint of view. There's only there's a collective.
You just can't say stuff. So what happens if you went on Threads and said, I'm a Jew and I believe that people should be allowed to make anti-Semitic remarks?
That I think you would offend. Basically, they wouldn't reply to you. They'd ask the Threads management team to.
Who's they? You mean the other Threads users?
Yeah.
Let's send you to jail, maybe, Keith, as our old friend Sam Bankman-Fried was sent to jail. And yet the headlines this week is that the FTX so-called victims, crypto fraud victims, are getting their money back plus interest. So did the media misrepresent the FTX story?
Well, you and me have debated this back and forth, and I always said that Bankman-Fried did what he did emotionally in order to try to save the company. He was trying to preserve assets, not steal them. And in trying to preserve them, he crossed lines. So I don't think emotionally he was a criminal, but he in fact was doing criminal things, but he wasn't emotionally a criminal. And the fact that the money is now being returned and then some, by the way, which won't satisfy everyone, because the reason that's possible is because Bitcoin and other coins have gone up in the meantime. And they would argue that if they were fully paid out, they would get all the gains from day one to today. They're not getting that. They're getting their original money as it was then, plus some interest. So they still would argue that they've lost in total value. But that said, it is evidence that Bankman-Fried trying to play a long game with the assets, had he not been arrested, probably would have worked out.
Yeah, I mean, I think he is inevitably going to be, quote unquote, rehabilitated. Michael Milken was also rehabilitated. Were you down in LA for the Milken event, or you were?
I was, but I wasn't at the Milken event. I was at an English guy called Charlie Muirhead at it.
Okay, well, you had an interesting story about the Milken event this week. His new power players. What's Milken suggesting? Another big finance guy who has successfully been rehabilitated.
So the Milken Conference is a private equity conference, meaning all kinds of assets other than public stocks are under discussion. To a certain, it's also some public discussions, but it's mainly private equity. And venture capital is a subset of private equity. And the point of this article, which The Information wrote, by the way, it's a very good article, is that venture capital is so much in the doghouse now from the point of view of investors in assets that it was relegated to the last session of the conference on day 3 when most people have already gone home. And the key narrative was that venture capital only produces fictional games called MOIC or TVPI. It doesn't produce distributions, that is to say, actual cash going back to the investors. And so venture capital is in that environment, which is a super important environment.
Yeah. So is it time for counterintuitive investment in VCs?
Oh, absolutely. This year and next year and the year after are going to be the best times to have invested in venture at the very time when nobody wants to.
Wow. But not for snowflakes, Keith.
Snowflakes are still greedy. So that's the ambiguity of a snowflake.
And then before we get to our startup of the week and our X of the week, you said you were also down in LA. What were you doing there? Which event?
So I was actually doing 2 events simultaneously. One was virtual, the other was physical. The physical one in LA was CogX. Charlie Muirhead is a British entrepreneur trying to reproduce a TED-like combination of entertainment, design, and tech, and attracted a crowd of well over 1,000. Like I had lunch with the CFO of Sony Entertainment and the head of biz dev, and also the person in charge of marketing Amazon Prime Video. I also met the founder of Epic Games there.
Were you a speaker or you were an attendee?
I was only an attendee there. I was meeting some of my investors who were there attending.
Any snowflakes there?
Oh, lots. It's LA. I mean, basically, I went to a restaurant on the last evening, and 90% of the menu was vegan.
So you mean?
And by the way, with this
is pronounced vegan, Keith.
Vegan. And by the way, this was an Italian restaurant, which
you mean that everyone who eats, as you would say, vegan, are they all snowflakes?
I will give people the space to do whatever they want, but I will judge them. And I think not eating meat, unless it's for ethical reasons, is certainly not for health reasons.
Well, you're going to drive off our significant vegan audience, Keith. They're all going to be offended. You're going to get posted. You're going to have a witch hunt against you on Threads. Of course, you won't watch. And speaking of vegan, your startup of the week is called Wave. Or maybe they borrowed it from Vave. What's Wave up to? An interesting company. Are they allowed to use that term, given the Israeli company that got acquired by Google, the map company?
Yeah, that's Waze.
Yeah, but it sounds a lot like it.
Yeah, well, obviously they are allowed because they did it.
And they're in the same business.
Not really in the same business. So what Wave does is it does what, there's a couple of subtleties here. There's a huge debate in the self-driving car tech community about whether you need radar, called LIDAR or LiDAR, in order to be good at creating a self-driving car. And Elon Musk says you do not, and he's stripped all the LiDAR out of Teslas, and all he uses is cameras and computers.
Which is why they crash all the time.
Actually, the new ones are fantastic. The new version of the Tesla self-driving, you could go on YouTube and do a search. It is actually exceptionally good. And what Wave are doing is the same thing. They have the same opinion as Elon, but they have an open source approach, which is to say that they're offering their technology to any car company.
Yeah.
And because all new cars come with surround cameras, they can just plug in their models in a computer, leveraging the cameras in the car, and produce an equally good experience as the new Tesla software, if not better. And they're getting a lot of traction. They just raised money, over $1 billion of new money from SoftBank.
And is this a UK-based company?
It is. It's UK.
Because Mike Butcher reported on it for TechCrunch. So this is all good news, Keith. What with the what would the critics of the future say? We still want to keep our hands on the steering wheel.
Yeah, that's a picture of a Ford Mach-E there, by the way, which is I own that car, and it does not do so.
I bet you don't have it in orange, though.
I would never buy a car in orange or yellow or green.
Well, you accused me before we went live of being gay because I want to buy the purple iPad. So are you suggesting that anyone who buys it in orange is gay?
I didn't accuse you of being gay because that would imply there's something wrong with being gay. I complimented you on your gayness.
Well, you observed it.
Yeah.
Well, that looks like an interesting company. I don't think that will be the last we hear of it. It's good news. It's good news for the UK economy for innovation, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the fact that SoftBank led the deal gives you a couple of pauses, given their track record, but you hope this is...
Makes complete sense. I mean, there's clearly a massive need in the market for this. Will they be acquired by a BMW or a Ford?
I hope not, because that means it won't become this generalized platform for all cars. I think the answer will only be yes if they fail to get customers.
And presumably the bigger players, I mean, Google bought Waze, of course, that they would be interested. The Googles, the Amazons, the Apples would be interested in this company too.
Yeah. And by the way, all the car companies have bought companies that are roughly in this space, but they're technically different. They're using LiDAR. This is the first company that doesn't use LiDAR that claims excellent results. And by the way, their platform supports robotics as well. It's not just for cars.
Well, last week we had a robotics company. And finally, we'll end where we began. Our X of the week is from our old friend Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, who talks about meet the new iPad Pro, the thinnest product we've ever created, the most advanced display we've ever produced with the incredible power of the M4 chip. Just imagine all the things it'll be used to create, including a lot of controversy.
Absolutely. And the fact that he used the word create tells you what the intent is in the ad. That's why I put it in. The intent's clear. I'm interested that Apple has not deleted either the video or this tweet.
Yeah, because they're not stupid. They don't care.
Yeah.
The thing that always annoys me about Apple is that every time they come out with something, they always say the thinnest, the most advanced we've ever produced. Do they always have to say that? By
the way, have you noticed that nobody was concerned about the trumpet being crushed? It was all the guitar. Why was that? Why is that, do you think?
Because I think snowflakes have a blind spot when it comes to trumpets.
Makes total sense, Andrew.
What about this idea of Apple always saying the biggest, the best, the fastest, the smartest?
Well,
should they drop that? Because doesn't it get boring? It's inevitable. If it isn't, then they wouldn't announce it.
Well, as a user, I'll tell you, I have the 11-inch iPad Pro 4th gen, and I use it for reading in bed before I go to sleep, and it's quite heavy. So your wrists definitely feel that you're holding something, and so thinner and lighter appeals to me as a buyer. So I think they just must know that from their surveys.
And you and I are very opposite kinds of consumers. We'll end here. We should announce what we're buying next week when the iPad comes out. You've already ordered. What are you buying, Keith?
I got the iPad Pro 11-inch with the keyboard and the pen and the pencil,
which is the smaller screen. I always think you like the biggest. Why are you going for the 11?
I would have the bigger screen if I was replacing my laptop with it, but I'm not. I use it for very specific things where the smaller screen is better. Reading books is probably my biggest use.
Well, I'm always obsessed with value, so I'm going for the iPad Air 13-inch, which is not going to cost me a great deal once I trade in. So there you are, Apple. You got a lot of free advertising. Next time we talk about you, you're going to be our advertiser. Have a good week, everyone. We'll see you next week.